Well, about 6 weeks ago, Arizona nearly lost one of its greatest treasures, the wild horses of the Salt River. The notice of intent to remove the rare herd almost went unnoticed in a local newspaper, but luckily it didn't go unnoticed. And the subsequent response, the tremendous media coverage, the outpouring of support from our community and from our politicians was enough to halt their removal. And that was a really good thing, because in the notice, these wild horses, this Arizona treasure, were described as unauthorized, which meant their destination most likely would have been the auction barn, and from there on a truck to a slaughterhouse. We are so very lucky that that didn't happen. Yes, thank you. If these wild horses had been removed, their unique beauty and heritage would have been gone forever. But because we stood together and our voices were collectively heard, this treasure, the Arizona Salt River wild horses, tonight are living peacefully in their home. But these horses are the lucky ones. Thousands of wild horses once roamed across the state of Arizona, but they were considered a nuisance or competition for natural resources. Mustangers was the term given to cowboys who were intent on ridding the range of these magnificent animals, and they would mercilessly chase them down, shoot and kill them, or gather them to be sent to slaughter. Sadly, today, there are fewer than 500 wild horses roaming across the entire state of Arizona. But what's the big deal, right? We have plenty of domestic horses. You see them everywhere. But herein lies a key misconception about wild horses. Wild horses are not the same as domestic horses. They have the instincts of a wild animal. They have highly developed, incredibly strong social structures. They are wildlife. They were born wild. Their family and social bonds are lifelong, and the wild horses of the Salt River were no exception. Truthfully, we may not have any wild horses left, not just in Arizona, but in our country, if not for the efforts of Velma Johnston, otherwise known as Wild Horse Annie. When she learned of the cruel manner in which wild horses were being removed from public land, she started a campaign to raise awareness, and the public was outraged. Congress received more mail than it had ever received on any issue to date, and in 1971, the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act was passed. And it stated that wild horses and burros are living symbols of our historic and pioneer spirit of the West. They contribute to the diversity of life in our nation, and they enrich our lives, but they were fast disappearing from the American scene. So it was the policy of Congress that wild horses and burros were to be protected from capture, branding, harassment, and death. And to do this, they were to be considered, wherever presently found, as an integral part of the natural system of public lands. So after the act was passed, a census was done across the millions of acres of public land in our country. And wherever wild horses and burros were found, they were granted protection, they and their descendants, under the law. 303 areas were identified where there were public horses or burros living on public land. Somehow, the wild horses of the Salt River were overlooked. Another wild horse herd that was overlooked in Arizona were the wild horses of Gila Bend, Arizona. These magnificent animals may very well be some of the last descendants of the horses that led the Spaniards across Arizona in the 1500s, but they were unpopular with the local ranchers, and they were often shot and killed or sent to slaughter. Luckily, a few were able to survive by hiding in the thick salt cedar that lines the bank of the Gila River. In 1996, Karen Sussman, president of the International Society for the Protection of Mustangs and Burros, learned of their existence when she was notified of the proposed removal of about 75 wild horses from along the river. Just like the wild horses of the Salt River, they were considered livestock, which mean and unauthorized, which meant their destination most likely would have been the auction barn, and from there on a truck to a slaughterhouse. She did not want to see that happen, so she began to do some research. She discovered they had a long and rich history in Arizona, and they'd been living along the river long before the act was passed. She worked with Interior Secretary Babbitt to gain them protection under the law, and they were successful. Right now, these beautiful, rare Spanish horses should be living along the river near Gila Bend, Arizona. But that wasn't meant to be. In 1999, a rancher complained that the wild horses had wandered into his hayfields. And although the law does allow for the removal of wild horses from private land, instead of returning them to the herd management area, the Bureau of Land Management elected to permanently remove them from their home. And this time, there was no public outcry, no tremendous media coverage, no social media posts, and not wanting to lose their unique and historic legacy, the International Society for the Protection of Mustangs and Burros and the BLM worked together to relocate 31 of these wonderful horses across the country to South Dakota. And that's too bad, because a post-census gather revealed there were no more wild horses living along the river near Gila Bend, Arizona. And these horses were a rare and beautiful find, an Arizona treasure for their history and their ability to survive when so many thousands of other wild horses could not. Each individual horse is spectacular, but when viewed as a herd, breathtaking. And although they are now living safe and free and thriving on the prairie in South Dakota, they are far, far away from Arizona. An Arizona treasure, gone. So I want to pause here for a moment because I want to emphasize that although the 1971 Act was expressly written and passed to protect our wild ones, it isn't always successful, as I have described. In fact, of the 303 areas that were originally identified that contained wild horses or burros, only 173 still contain wild horses or burros. In fact, across our country right now, only about half of the number of wild horses and burros are living free on public land than they were in 1971 when the act was passed, when they were described as fast disappearing from the American scene. Only about half. And that's so incredibly sad, unjust, and wrong. Our country's wild horses are not safe. Arizona's wild horses are not safe, and that statement could not be more true today than it is right now for the wild horses of the Heber Territory. Unlike the wild horses of the Salt River or of Gila Bend, Arizona, these horses were not overlooked when the act was passed, and they were given their own territory in the Apache Sitgreaves Forest, where they were supposed to be protected from branding, capture, harassment, or death. But these wild horses have been anything but safe. In the 40-plus years since they were given their territory and the act was passed, the Forest Service has yet to develop a territory management plan to ensure they are an integral part of the natural system of public lands. And in 2005, they sent out a notice that they were going to remove about 300 unauthorized horses from the Apache Sitgreaves Forest. Just like the wild horses of the Salt River or of Gila Bend, Arizona, they were described as unauthorized. Sound familiar? And just as with the wild horses of the Salt River or of Gila Bend, Arizona, their destination most likely would have been the auction barn, and from there on a truck to a slaughterhouse. Luckily, local and national communities were able to get involved and stop the removal, but this one is so far from over. In their recent land management report, the Forest Service described our beautiful, treasured wild horses of the Heber Territory as an invasive species, strays, or feral. And meanwhile, some of the local ranchers have stated basically the same thing. They've said that they don't want to share our public lands that belongs to all of us, with our treasured wild horses. They have stated that they don't believe that our wild horses deserve to be protected under the act. And meanwhile, our wild horses of the forest are disappearing. There are about 100 fewer now in the forest than there were 10 years ago. 1/3 of our wild horses have disappeared. And even as those numbers continue to fall and continue to dwindle, there are still those out there making public statements about wanting every one of our wild horses removed. Well, enough is enough. This Arizona treasure, these wild horses, their distinct characteristics, their tenacity, their individualism, their strength, their courage, the ability to survive when so many other wild horses could not, make them a unique and important part of Arizona history. And they belong to all of us. They belong to you and your children and your grandchildren. When we can see what is happening, as we could see with the wild horses of the Salt River, then we can react as a community and we can create change. But when we are blind to what is happening, when events are lost in obscurity, as they were with the wild horses of Gila Bend, Arizona, then we are helpless, and then it is too late. But it is not too late to save the wild horses of the Heber Territory. Please, join our fight to save all of our country's wild horses. You can follow and support the Heber Wild Horses community on Facebook and on the internet to know the latest of what's going on with them. You can contact your local media, your politicians, share these stories with your community, and voice your support for all of Arizona's treasured wild horses. And the International Society for the Protection of Mustangs and Burros works tirelessly on behalf of all of our country's wild horses. And as for Arizona, we have so few remaining wild horses, and we have already lost one rare and historic herd. We cannot afford to lose another. Thank you.